Ramen is the most famous noodle soup on the planet. But ramen's journey to global stardom was anything but obvious. In fact, for most of Japan's history, the dish we now call ramen didn't even exist there. Here's a picture of what Japanese people were eating around 1850. Lots of rice, grilled fish, pickled vegetables, miso soup, and soba or udon noodles made from buckwheat and wheat. Notice anything missing? That's right, no ramen. For more than 200 years, Japan had sealed itself off from the rest of the world under a policy called sakoku. Foreigners weren't welcome, Japanese people couldn't leave, and new food ideas basically stopped at the border. But in 1853, an American naval officer named Commodore Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay with a fleet of massive black warships and made Japan an offer it couldn't refuse. Open your ports to foreign trade or face the consequences. Japan looked at those cannons, did the math, and reluctantly opened the door to the outside world. Once Japan cracked open its doors, people and ideas started pouring in, including Chinese merchants, cooks, and laborers who settled in port cities like Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagasaki. They brought their own food with them, and one of those foods was a Chinese wheat noodle soup called ramen. Japanese locals got curious about the Chinatown restaurants, tried the noodles, and thought, hey, this is actually pretty good. But this wasn't ramen yet. Not the ramen you know. It was still basically a Chinese dish being eaten by Chinese immigrants. The transformation was going to take a while. Fast forward to 1910. A restaurant called Rai Raikan opens in Tokyo's Asakusa neighborhood. The owner hired 12 Chinese cooks from Yokohama's Chinatown and told them to make their noodle soup but tweaked for Japanese tastes. They used a soy sauce-based broth made with chicken and pork bones, topped it with sliced pork, bamboo shoots and green onions, and called it Shina Soba, which basically meant Chinese, it's noodles. It was a huge hit. Workers, students, and anyone with a few coins in their pocket lined up for a bowl. And just like that, the foundation of modern ramen was laid. Over the next couple of decades, Shina Soba spread across Japan. Every region started putting its own spin on it. But then came the 1940s, and things got ugly. World War II was a disaster for Japan. Cities were bombed, food was rationed, and by 1945, the country was starving. Wheat was almost impossible to find. Ramen shops shut down. Selling noodles on the street was actually illegal for a while because the government wanted to control every grain of wheat. But here's where it gets interesting. After the war, the United States started shipping huge amounts of wheat flour to Japan as aid. Suddenly, there was more wheat around than rice. And what do you make with wheat? That's right, noodles. Black markets popped up everywhere, and street vendors started selling cheap, hot, filling bowls of noodle soup to hungry workers rebuilding their cities. Ramen wasn't just food anymore. It was survival. It was comfort. It was a small, warm thing in a country that had lost almost everything. Then, in 1958, a guy named Momofuku Ando changed the world. Ando had watched people lining up in the freezing cold outside ramen stalls after the war, and he became obsessed with one question. How do you make ramen that anyone can prepare at home in just a few minutes? He spent a year experimenting in a little shed behind his house. He tried drying noodles in the sun, baking them, steaming them. Nothing worked. Then, one day he watched his wife frying tempura and had a light bulb moment. What if you flash-fried the noodles in oil? The oil would drive out the water, leaving dry noodles full of tiny holes, perfect for soaking up hot water later. It worked. And instant ramen was born. Ando called his company Nissin, and the first product was chicken ramen. It was expensive at first, about 6 times the price of fresh udon, but people still couldn't get enough of it. Then, in 1971, Ando had another wild idea. What if you put the noodles in a cup so people could eat them anywhere? No bowl needed. Just add hot water. Cup noodle was born, and it spread like wildfire. It helped that a few months later, there was a hostage crisis in Japan where police officers were filmed on live TV eating cup noodles in the freezing cold. Every Japanese person watching thought, I need to try that. By the 1980s, instant ramen was everywhere. Students lived on it. Astronauts took it to space. In 2000, the Japanese even voted instant ramen as their country's greatest invention of the 20th century. Not the Walkman, not the bullet train, noodles in a cup. Meanwhile, back in the world of actual restaurant ramen, something amazing was happening. Regional styles were exploding in popularity. Up in Hokkaido, where the winters are brutally cold, Sapporo perfected a rich miso ramen, thick, salty, buttery, sometimes topped with sweet corn. Down in Kyushu, the city of Fukuoka gave the world tonkotsu, a creamy pork bone broth simmered for so long that the bones basically dissolve into the soup. Tokyo stuck with its classic soy sauce style. Kitakata, Hakata, Wakayama, Onomichi. Every city wanted its own flavor, its own noodle shape, its own bragging rights. By the 1990s, ramen had gone from cheap worker food to something people obsessed over. Ramen chefs became celebrities. TV shows ranked the best shops in the country. Lines stretched around city blocks. A movie called Tampopo came out in 1985 and basically treated ramen like a spiritual experience. Watching that film made a whole generation take ramen seriously as art. Then ramen started leaving Japan. It had actually been trickling out for decades. Instant ramen hit American supermarkets in 1972 under the name Top Ramen, and college students everywhere immediately adopted it as their primary food source. But restaurant ramen was a different story. For a long time, outside of Japan, ramen meant the dried brick in the plastic wrapper. That changed in the 2000s. A chef named David Chang opened Momofuku Noodle Bar in New York in 2004, naming it after Momofuku Ando himself. Chang's ramen wasn't strictly traditional, but it was amazing, and suddenly food critics were writing about ramen the way they used to write about French cooking. Ivan Orkin, an American chef, did something even crazier. He moved to Tokyo and opened a ramen shop run by a foreigner. Japanese customers were skeptical at first. Then they tasted it and admitted, okay, this guy actually gets it. By the 2000s and 10s, proper ramen shops were opening in London, Paris, Sydney, São Paulo, everywhere. Tonkotsu chains like Ippudo and Ichiran went global. People in countries that had never heard of Sapporo started arguing about whether the noodles should be firm or soft. And instant ramen, it just kept growing. Today, people around the world eat more than 100 billion servings of instant ramen every single year. That's about 13 packets for every person on Earth. The biggest market isn't even Japan anymore. It's China, followed by Indonesia, India, Vietnam, and the United States. South Korea eats the most per person, averaging around 80 packets a year. 80 per person. Now here's the really wild part. In 2005, instant ramen finally left Earth. Momofuku Ando, then 95 years old, developed a special version called Space Ram that could be eaten in zero gravity. Japanese astronaut Soichi Noguchi took it up on the Space Shuttle Discovery. The same guy who had invented instant noodles in a backyard Shed watched his creation go to space. Ando passed away 2 years later at the age of 96. His last meal, according to his company, was a bowl of chicken ramen. So what started as a Chinese noodle soup eaten by immigrants in port towns became the national comfort food of Japan. Then the survival food of a country rebuilding from war. Then a symbol of convenience. Then a global obsession. Then, literally, food for astronauts. Not bad for a bowl of noodles. And ramen isn't done evolving. Chefs today are making vegan tonkotsu, using unusual broths like lamb and seafood, experimenting with noodle textures, and crossbreeding ramen with dishes from every cuisine you can think of. The next chapter is still being written, probably in a tiny shop somewhere with 10 seats and a line out the door. If you want me to make more videos like this, please subscribe to let me know. See you next time.